Good evening. My name is Brian Curran. I'm the mayor of Lynbrook. Since being elected mayor back in March, the Village Hall has been working hard to actually reshape the television station to offer more informative and interesting program about Lynbrook for its residents. I'm happy to introduce the first in a series of installments regarding Lynbrook's history. Tonight you're going to actually join Art Mattson, who's the Lynbrook Village historian, on a walking tour of Lynbrook and its interesting history that follows. Sit back, enjoy the show, and after the show, if you want to actually read more about Lynbrook's history, you can go down to the Lynbrook Public Library and take out Art Mattson's History of Lynbrook book, which is available to all readers. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Art Mattson, Lynbrook Village historian, and welcome to this first segment of a few minutes of Lynbrook history. I'm standing in the Rockville Cemetery. It's at the intersection of Ocean Avenue, Merrick Road, right across from Hot Skates. This place is a kind of a no man's land. It's not quite in the village of Lynbrook, not quite in the village of Rockville Center. It's governed by the town of Hempstead and the New York State Cemetery Board. You may wonder why I've selected this place of all places to start off a segment on Lynbrook history. Well, when people think of history on Long Island, they typically would think of places like, say Oyster Bay, or perhaps Port Jefferson, maybe Sag Harbor. But no, right here, right at the border of Lynbrook and Rockville Center, this cemetery, right around it, it's one of the most historic spots on all of Long Island. My goodness, right behind me is an incredible amount of history. We have right here a monument, a shipwreck monument. In this place, 139 people are buried in a mass grave. These were all victims of two spine-chilling, terrifying shipwrecks off Long Beach and Rockaway in 1836 and 1837. Some of the awful story is told here in engravings on the four sides of the monument. These wrecks were the biggest news stories of the decade. Walt Whitman wrote a poem about one of the wrecks in Leaves of Grass. Curry and Ives did prints. And 139 bodies were brought here. Why here? Why to Lynbrook? Well, this was a desolate place, pretty much. There were scattered homes around, but there were no other churches, no other cemeteries between here and the South Shore. And so when those ships struck the bar at Rockaway Beach and Long Beach, the bodies were taken on sleds over the frozen ground. Trenches were dug, 100-foot long trenches, and the coffins were laid in shoulder to shoulder along the trenches. And the local citizens were generous with contributions for this monument. They called it the Mariners' Burying Ground. This monument is of white marble, and it was carved in Sing Sing, of all places, paid for by contributions that were raised from people who lived around here, and also from the money that was taken from the bodies of the immigrants, mostly from Ireland, that washed ashore. And so the monument was brought down by barge down the Hudson River and placed here. It's worn now, but it does tell a story about the wrecks of the Bristol and the Mexico, the numbers of people who died, about Captain McCown and about Captain Winslow. Down here is an interesting thing. It actually describes the dimensions of the plot that is called the Mariners' Burying Ground. It was to be preserved forever for the use of burying victims of shipwrecks. Now there's a piece here that's missing, right along here. It once told the exact dimensions of the Mariners' Burying Ground, which at one time had as much as 100 feet in length of the trenches into which the coffins were placed. But giving a new meaning to chiseling, some prior owners, or I should say operators of this cemetery, chiseled out this dimension so that they could bury other people on the very places where the wooden crosses and wooden markers for the graves had rotted away over the many, many years. And now they've been reused, so we see brass plaques on places where those unfortunate 139 people were buried. But there's more to the history of this place than 1830s. I want to take you back even further, back many centuries before that, to the time when the Indians were here. Over 1,000 years ago, the Lenape Indians, they were an Algonquin group, crossed over from New Jersey to Staten Island, then from Staten Island to Long Island, came along the South Shore to here. And one of those groups, they call themselves the Rachquaaki. That name sounds a little familiar, and it should, because the English changed that name to Rockaway. But they call themselves the Rachquaaki. They settled here, right near this cemetery, in the area between Lynbrook and Rockville Center. The reason they settled here was that just on the other side of Ocean Avenue is the Mill River. And the Mill River was exactly what the Rachquaaki were looking for. Fresh water flowing down from Hempstead, salt water just to the south on the other side of Sunrise Highway. And so they had hunting to the north. They had canoe trips they could take to the south to get to clams, oysters, to the fish there, to the crabs, a year-round nutritious supply of food. And speaking of clams, we have this, a stone tool, which was found in Lynbrook over on Union Avenue. It's actually a clam knife, and to show you a modern one, I have this one here. I brought this over to Adelphi, to a professor of anthropology. He examined it, he pronounced it, yes, a prehistoric stone tool. Furthermore, he said, he believed that this was owned by an Indian woman, and that she was right-handed. Stunned that he could draw these conclusions, I asked how he could have determined that. He said, well, first of all, it would be the Indian women who would have done the food preparation and thus opening the clams. The men may have gone out and done the hunting and the fishing. He also noted a wear mark, I see it right here, that would imply that it was a right-handed person who used this tool to open clams. As the Lenapes came along the south shore of Long Island, it wasn't only the Rockaways that settled here. The Canarsies settled to the west, and then the Merricks and the Massapequa. Because these tribes, these groups, found that places just like this, near a river, salt and fresh, was the perfect place for them to establish themselves. And because they wanted to communicate with each other, they developed an Indian trail that ran along just exactly at that same margin. It's here still today, only we don't call it the Merrickoke Trail, which it was called by the Indians, the name for the Merrick tribe. It's called the Merrick Road. That Merrick Road runs from Jamaica all the way out to Montauk Point. Its basic purpose, as I said, was to connect the various Indian families along the south shore of Long Island. The Mill River, which is right behind me, not only brought sustenance to the Indians in terms of fresh water, access to hunting, transportation to the salt water, but it also brought what eventually became the means to their death. Because it was in 1643 that Robert Fordham and John Carman, two Englishmen, crossed over the Long Island Sound by boat, landed about where Roslyn is today, and then set out on a trek across Long Island. They crossed over the Hempstead Plains, And when they got there, they said, this is a fantastic place for us to settle because the grazing land was absolutely perfect. Moreover, Hempstead is the source of the Mill River. And so there was fresh water for their grazing animals. They decided to walk down the Mill River. And so it would be along what we would call now Hempstead Lake Park with all its ponds. That's all the Mill River. They walked along the river and came down here and found the Merrick Road, the old Indian Trail. I'm not sure if they were on this side of the river or the Rockville Center side. It's not important. No one really knows. But they encountered a large Indian encampment right near the river. And of course, it's no surprise they would be here because this was, as I said before, the perfect place for them to live. At this moment in time, Robert Fordham and John Carman engaged in what was probably the worst real estate scam to ever hit Long Island. For $100 worth of axes and knives, which the Indians were thrilled to receive, they encouraged the Indians to sign with X's the bottom of a deed which transferred the permanent rights forever to their heirs and assigns, forever, to all the lands south of the Hempstead Plains, from what we would now know as from Queens to Suffolk County. In other words, the entire town of Hempstead was granted over to these two Englishmen for a few axes and knives. The Rockaways, the Merricks, the Massapeagues all put their X's on the bottom of the document, having no idea that fences would begin to go up. And they would begin to be pushed south. South towards Bay Park, south further Island Park. Those were then islands out there, not connected to the mainland. There was no fresh water there because the Mill River there is salt. And so they had to depend on rainwater. There was food enough, I guess, from the clams and oysters, but it was a harsh life and they began to die off. Worse than that was the diseases that the English brought, smallpox and other diseases. By 1818, less than 200 years after Fordham and Carman arrived, there was only one Indian left, Kalulu, and he died in that year, 1818. In the late 1600s and the 1700s, as the Indians, the Rockaways, were dying off, the English were surviving and prospering. One of the reasons was this river, the Mill River, because this became the place where mills, and that's the name of the Mill River, could be built to grind corn and wheat, to saw wood for building houses. 6 of them along the Mill River, starting with the one down in East Rockaway, the old grist mill, which was built in 1689, all the way north to one that's up near Hempstead called the Eagle Mill. That mill was so big that it provided flour to New York City, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, I should say, Boston, and even shipped to London. Now, by this point, you probably have the idea that this is a pretty historic place. But my goodness, did you know there was a Revolutionary War battle fought right here? It was June 21st, 1776, only days before the Declaration of Independence was signed. George Washington was hunkered down on Brooklyn Heights somewhere. The English were arriving in a fleet about to invade. And there was a lot of tension right here because there were two groups. Further north and to the west were the Patriots, but here they were Tories, supported the king, did not want George Washington or the revolutionaries to make any progress. And so they marched around with their muskets in this area. Washington heard about it. And he also heard that there was a plot afoot to kidnap him. That if he ever came down the Merrick Road out on Long Island, he would be kidnapped here at this place. So he did what we would call a preemptive strike. He sent his own force of Minutemen down the Merrick Road from Jamaica. They marched right along here, right where we are, right to this intersection of Ocean and Merrick. Only then Ocean was called Long Lane. Just opposite where I'm standing, on the other side of the river, was a mill, DeMott's Mill. Now, by prearrangement, the miller, DeMott, hung a white sheet from the upstairs of the mill. This was a warning to all the Tories in the area to gather up your muskets and get the heck out because the enemy was coming. They ran up Long Lane and headed up to what we now know as Tanglewood. The Minutemen chased them, and a fierce musket battle took place. The Minutemen apparently were better marksmen because one of the men, one of the Tories, George Smith, was shot in the chest with a musket ball, fell down, wounded, did not die. All the other Tories threw down their muskets and gave up to Washington's men. They were taken across Long Island over to Connecticut, where they spent the rest of the Revolutionary War in a prison. By the early 1800s, there still was no village of Lynbrook, no village of Rockville Center, but there was a settlement. And that settlement was right here at the intersection of what they then called Long Lane, it's Ocean Avenue, and the Merrick Road. Around here were 40 scattered farmhouses. There was DeMott's Mill. And there also was a general store and a post office just across the street. And for a while it seemed that maybe the village that would end up might be a kind of a Lynbrook Rockville Center right here, with the center of town right here. But that was not to be, because the residents decided that they wanted a post office on each side of the river, and a general store on each side of the river, and a church on each side of the river. They each wanted their own place. And so that set in motion a set of forces that split this small settlement. By the way, it was called Parson's Corners. And it was called that because the parsonage for this church was located here. And so the gravitational forces began, put in place on the Lynbrook side, primarily by a man named Wright Pearsall. Many of the founders of Lynbrook and of East Rockaway and Rockville Center are buried here in this cemetery. Some of the names were very familiar to you because there are streets even named after them. The Riders, Smith, Abrams, and of course there's the Pearsalls. And this is the monument to Wright Pearsall. This is the family grave of the Pearsall family. Now Wright Pearsall is the founder of the village of Lynbrook at the place that it is now, which is basically at the Five Corners. And in a few minutes we'll walk over towards the Five Corners and we'll see where Wright Pearsall established what became the heart, the very heart of what is today Lynbrook. We've just walked down the Merrick Road to this place, the Five Corners, and this is where Lynbrook really got its start. Remember Wright Pearsall? I pointed out his grave over in the cemetery. He was the young man who really set this place up. Wright was the son of another, I believe his name was Wright Pearsall also, from East Rockaway. And his dad had a general store down there. But young Wright felt that there really was no settlement along the Merrick Road here, and that this would be the perfect place, right here where I'm standing, to set up a general store. The reason he was so clever, transportation was the key. Just looking around us, these roads, this 5-point intersection, Merrick Road, you can travel all the way to Montauk on the road heading out east, on Merrick heading west, all the way down to Jamaica. Then we have Broadway. What a great pathway, without even the sea in the way, no crossings, all the way out to Rockaway Beach. And then down Atlantic Avenue. Brings us down to East Rockaway, to the port that's there, to the mill, the East Rockaway grist mill. And then finally we have Hempstead Avenue, because Hempstead Avenue leads to the economic and business center of this entire portion of Long Island, the village of Hempstead. So he really knew what he was doing when he set up his general store right in his spot at the Five Corners. In fact, he was so smart, he had a realtor's mind. He bought up the land all around here. He also was smart enough to know that the road had to be improved. And so he did something that's called planking. He made a corduroy road, planked the road. Merrick Road was planked from Jamaica to Merrick. Now this really became the perfect place, and others decided that they wanted to move here too. Blacksmith shops and dry goods stores and on and on. And of course, Wright would sell them at a premium price, the parcels of land. Then along came the railroad. The Long Island Railroad, actually then it was called the South Side Railroad, came along just at the end of the Civil War, about 1866. And when they opened Pearsall Station, this whole area really started to bloom and boom. So much so that houses began to spring up all around this area. Even mansions were built here. They've mostly been torn down, but this was a really booming town on Long Island. Our time is up for today. As you've seen, though, there's a tremendous amount of history here in Lynbrook, and there's a lot more to be told. We'll do that in future segments. But for now, this is Art Mattson, thanking you for watching a few minutes of Lynbrook history.